Hello, welcome to Headlines Special. The year 2024 was relatively peaceful on the Azerbaijani-Armenian front, seeing no major outbreak of fighting but sporadic flare-ups and witnessing some tangible and measurable progress on the text of what is officially referred to as the Agreement on Peace and Interstate Normalization, and also on border delimitation as well. By early 2025, Baku and Yerevan have agreed the 90% of the peace deal, achieving consensus on 15 out of 17 articles of the document, with 2 unresolved provisions related to refraining from international legal actions against each other and prohibition against deploying third country representatives along the interstate border remaining. There are some other lingering issues outside the realm of the peace deal which will need to be resolved for the deal itself to be attained. These stumbling blocks refer to the Azerbaijani demand as to the amendment of Armenia's constitution and the official de jure disbandment of the OSCE Minsk Group, a body once tasked with the mediating between the parties. In 2024, thanks to direct bilateral talks, Baku and Yerevan achieved the delimitation and demarcation of the 12.7-kilometer section of the border, transforming that particular segment of the delineation line into formal interstate border. Earlier this week, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan stated that 4 years after its defeat in the war with Azerbaijan, Armenia has a chance to become truly sovereign and independent country. Many analysts would now say that Armenian Premier views his country's defeat back in 2020 as a blessing in disguise. Indeed, what has been a massively historic victory for Azerbaijan could now become an opportunity for Armenia, leading to peace between these two nations, changing the whole destiny of the region and beyond. And joining me today is Dr. Robert Cutler, Director and Senior Fellow, Energy Security Program, NATO Association of Canada, also practitioner member of Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and also for many years he was a senior researcher at the Institute of European, Russian and Eurasian Studies, Carleton University. He's based in Montreal, Canada. Dr. Cutler, welcome to Headlines Special.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know where to begin. There's so many things I would like to discuss with you. But my first question is going to be very basic, and it is going to be of introductory nature. Back in 2024, there were many people expecting that Azerbaijan and Armenia would finalize the year by signing a peace deal. And also the reports coming from both sides were indicating that considerable amount of work on the peace deal had been completed, and there was expectation that sides could sign something which is incomplete, but nothing eventuated from those claims. Were you surprised, and why?
Well, no, I was not surprised because I did not have expectations one way or the other. I believe that it's entirely proper and a good strategy not to sign an interim document, because if questions are left unresolved by the interim document, then there is always the risk that the interim document will become eternalized and that the remaining questions would never be settled. So I was not surprised that there was no final treaty in 2024. Let us put it that way.
I see. And also, of course, we know there are sort of parties agreed on 15 out of 17 articles. We understand that those 2 articles are related to the prohibition of third-party involvement on the border and also refraining from international legal actions. But there are some other sort of stumbling blocks which need to be resolved. They are not part of the peace deal, but if they are not resolved, peace deal will not be attained. And one of them, the central one, is Armenia's constitution. To be more precise, the preamble of Armenia's constitution, referencing 1990 declaration, which is in its turn refers to 1989 decision. Azerbaijan believes that this must be solved. Armenia claims that there's going to be a treaty provision in line with which no party will be able to refer to its domestic legislation in order to be able to obviate its international obligation. Azerbaijan believes that it's not good enough. Why do you think Azerbaijan is so insistent on the official removal of what is known as the Miatsum provision?
Well, as you know, the preamble of any constitution, any state constitution, is not formally a part of that constitution. And as you know, the Armenian Supreme Court has ruled that the preamble remains in force only insofar as it refers to any article in the Constitution itself. And the argument is made that no article in the Constitution itself invokes the preamble. Therefore, the preamble has no weight in law. The problem with this, as you know, is that the Supreme Court ruled years ago that Robert Kocharyan was a legitimate candidate, a legal candidate. He could legally put forth his candidacy for the presidency of Armenia, notwithstanding the fact that he had never lived on the territory of the Republic of Armenia, for which is a constitutional requirement. And his residence in the Soviet-era Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast was taken to represent a satisfaction of the constitutional requirement of his residence in the Republic of Armenia. And so it is disingenuous, I would say, to suggest that the preamble has no weight because it had this very real effect of permitting Kocharyan to put forth his candidacy and indeed to serve as president for 10 years. Therefore, from my point of view, the Azerbaijani insistence on the revision of the preamble to the Constitution is reasonable.
And we understand that that preamble, that particular element within the preamble, can only be removed via referendum, which will not take place until late 2026. And bearing in mind that it is Azerbaijan's demand that this matter should be resolved in a crystal clear way, could we now confidently say that there will be no peace deal between Baku and Yerevan until 2026, until late 2026?
I should say that it is foreseeable that this will remain an obstacle until then.
I see. And also about of course, another important point, which is not part of the peace deal, but remains a stumbling block. It is related to OSCE Minsk Group, a body which was once tasked to mediate between the parties. There is a school of view prevailing in Azerbaijan that this body became completely irrelevant in November 2020 after the end of 44-day war, because this body was supposed to resolve the issue, and that issue had practically been resolved by that time. And then, so it was fatally wounded in November 2020, and then it faced this relevance test. In February 2022, when former co-chair countries ceased to coordinate, it became clinically dead. And then when Azerbaijan restored its de facto sovereignty of the rest of the Karabakh, it became its situation exacerbated. And now it is time to kill it legally. To what extent do you think that this organization, which is de facto dead, should also de jure be disbanded? And to what extent it could contribute to the mutual trust between the countries?
Well, it does seem to be the case that the Minsk Group is, as the French say, caduc. It's served its purpose, so to speak. To be generous, one could say that it had sought to serve its purpose. The Minsk Group, as you know, was predicated upon the peaceful resolution of the conflict, which did not take place. If one looks at the Madrid principles, it's very clear that these are outdated, that they no longer apply, that the problems that the Madrid principles were designed to resolve have been resolved by other means and are no longer problems. And so I do recall reading not too long ago that the Russian Foreign Ministry had emitted the opinion that the Minsk Group served no longer any purpose. And just within the last week or two, you can correct me if I have the detail wrong, Prime Minister Pashinyan said something to the effect that he would be willing to dispense de jure with the OSCE Minsk group if certain understandings from Azerbaijan were received, which I believe that what may well be involved here is not only his attempt domestically to avoid the exacerbation of political opposition, but although one does not hear or read very much about it or anything at all, it seems in the political logic of things, because Pashinyan, he's in Washington, D.C. yesterday,
Yes.
and that he is in a direct or an indirect negotiation, not even by words, but by gestures, with the Armenian diaspora, elements of which, as you know, have been the most radical, militant, vociferous, irredentist, uncompromising, especially in the American and in Washington and Paris aspects. And it's very possible that he is maintaining those as a compromise so that they won't give him more trouble in Azerbaijan, because the American organization, for example, the most vociferous American organization, has its own institutional interests. They still claim things about the trial going on in Baku, to the trials going on in Baku. They claim things about the former Nagorno-Karabakh, and they do this because they need to raise funds, because otherwise they will have to move out of their offices and find a new job. And that's just the logic of things. So that my view is that the OSCE did not succeed in resolving the issue, that the issue is de facto resolved, and that the Minsk group serves only a purpose to obstruct a final settlement. To which it is interesting, you mentioned that as from February 2022, referencing the reinvigoration of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, that the three parties, the three co-chairs, France, the US, and Russia, stopped coordinating. And of course, that is true. What you did not say, but I'm certain you know, is that there were also 8 other members of the Minsk group, other than the three co-chairs, and they were never consulted. So that even since the 1990s, so that hypothetically, if one wished to maintain the Minsk group, one would have to reinvigorate it, change the leadership structure, find new terms of reference for it from the OSCE itself, throw out the Madrid principles, and but now that Azerbaijan and Armenia are speaking directly, bilaterally, on a daily and weekly basis, there's no need for any such intervention by external parties, just as the useful at the time intermediation by Charles Michel in Brussels and by Anthony Blinken in Washington a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was useful at the time, but any further intermediation can only obstruct the direct communication between the sides now.
And recently, the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, said that yes, indeed, OSCE Minsk Group should be disbanded. And the reason the way he explained the jure disbandment was very interesting. She was effectively blaming, in my humble opinion, the way it looks to me and to many other sort of observers, she blamed Nikol Pashinyan. She said that after Armenia recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity in early October 2022 in Prague, there was absolutely no reason for this group to remain. And we also know that very recently the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that he and President Putin were astonished when they heard that Pashinyan had recognized Karabakh, Azerbaijan territorial integrity, including Karabakh. So the feeling there is that Russia was surprised back in October, And we remember what Vladimir Putin said in late October. He said that we don't believe that it is the best solution, but this is what you think you should do. But we do not believe that this is the wise choice. What does a Russian rationale, Russian argumentation, do you think reveal about Moscow's intentions, past or present, as long as Azerbaijan and Armenia are concerned?
Well, that's a very deep question with many ramifications. It first of all, I recall the Russian statement, official statements concerning, and I recall press reports to the effect that they even tried to dissuade Pashinyan from this, and that they were very unhappy about it. Clearly, this attitude translates the long-standing, 2 centuries-long Russian wish to maintain ethnic divisions and oppositions in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, in order to be able to play the balance, in order to weaken all the parties. That's the first issue that strikes one between the eyes. There's no other motive for that. And they have no choice but to accept official Yerevan's recognition of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. And also it relieved or dismissed or eliminated any pretext, any possible pretext for the continuing presence of the Russian so-called peacekeepers on the Karabakh territory. So I'm sure it was a shock to them, but that is the way things happen. And certainly the recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity was an absolute sine qua non, absolute necessity for the next steps on the treaty.
And the negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia have been bilateral, purely bilateral, I think, since October 2023. And we remember the 7th of December joint statement issued on the 7th of December, naturally on the 7th of December 2023. Do you think that there's absolutely no chance for negotiations to attract third parties and become tripartite, quadripartite from now on? This bilateral nature is so firmly entrenched that this will not change. And also I would like you to reflect on their progress on the border delimitation and demarcation. We know that 12.7 kilometer section has been delimited and demarcated, and that part of the border actually is now official interstate border between the two countries.
Concerning the first part of your question, it seems to me that in order for any third party to play an active role in the now bilateral negotiations would require the agreement of both parties of the bilateral negotiations. And it would be very surprising if Azerbaijan were to agree to this, because Azerbaijan has very reasonably always insisted that the best way for the negotiations to be conducted would be by direct bilateral contact, as they have been, as you said, since the end of 2023. And even when the sides met in Kazakhstan, basically they were given a table to sit at, and I don't believe that the Kazakhstan hosts were even in the room. So that's the answer to that question. As for the delimitation, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I do recall reading that perhaps it was the border committee had agreed to, in principle, to delimit not only to delimit but also to demarcate. For your listeners who may not know, the difference being that delimitation refers to the drawing of a line on a map and the physical geographical description of the boundary, whereas demarcation refers to the actual physical planting of markers on the border itself. so that the Border Commission has agreed in principle, on the delimitation and demarcation of the entire border, starting from the northernmost point where the two countries share a border with Georgia, going down through the segment which has already been demarcated, and down all the way. So that information is the basis. That information is my answer. If it's correct information, is my answer to the second part of your question.
Yeah, I believe that 12.7 kilometer section has been officially, formally, completely both delimited and demarcated. But in relation to the rest, there is a sort of principle agreement in principle. But what kind of maps will be used? Will they be the latest Soviet maps or not the latest Soviet maps? All of the things will be thrashed out at a later stage. So that's the reason why I think many analysts and officials in Azerbaijan say that only 12.7 kilometer section of our border is now formal interstate border, with the rest being still conditional interstate border, in relation to which there is an agreement in principle.
That's certainly the case. The 12.7 kilometers is demarcated. I do recall a press report several months ago to the effect that the Prime Minister Pashinyan had admitted that the most recent Soviet military map would not be the only authority.
Yeah, yeah, it's
so yes, to be sure, there are some segments of the border further south that may be contested between the two sides, and have been contested on the ground, and that those require resolution. In law, it is not, if I recall correctly, in law, it is not a prerequisite that the entire border be demarcated for the signature of the treaty between the two sides to be valid. I mean, unless one of the two sides insists upon it, it's not a legal condition that because the parties are the states and they recognize each other's integrity and so on and so on and so on, so that that is not a stumbling block unless one of the sides wants it to be a stumbling block.
Yes.
Also, President Aliyev recently, in early January, characterized the border delimitation talks in Munich during the security conference, that this discussion took place there, as a one-sided process where Azerbaijan stays its position and Armenia eventually complies without much verbal engagement. Because what President Aliyev said, I believe, if memory serves correctly, he said that we did explain our position, Armenians did not react, did not show any receptiveness, and then there were certain actions on the ground which led to the withdrawal of Armenian forces from those four villages, ending up with that ending up with that reality on the ground. And many analysts, I think, if memory serves me correctly, former Armenian Deputy Foreign Minister, I think he said that, Gerard Libardian said that within the Azerbaijani-Armenian dynamics, there's one logic. If Armenia does not react to what Azerbaijan says, does not show sufficient receptiveness, the next demand from Azerbaijan becomes even more demanding, so to speak. And Armenia, as a result of that, is sort of by virtue of circumstances and also balance of power between the two nations, finds itself compelled to lose more. Just connecting what President Aliyev said about one-sided monologue and what Gerard Libardian said some years ago, do you concur with this logic that many people are actually talking about?
Well, it seems at least as reasonable to me that if the talks are not between the heads of state, but only between their delegates and their ministers, that on the Armenian side, it's entirely possible and even understandable that they, from official Yerevan, they have the orders only to listen and not to react, and not even to negotiate, but to report back to Yerevan what is said by official Baku. This is not unknown in negotiations. Um, I recall when back in the 90s and the 2000s when uh, the Iranians and the Indians were negotiating over the so-called peace pipeline, the Iran, Pakistan, India gas pipeline that has never been built. That one of the reasons why the Indians uh, gave up was, well, there were two reasons why the Indians gave up. The first was that the Iranians negotiators had no mandate to negotiate. They always had to call home, as it were. And second, whenever they agreed to something at one meeting, you come back to the next meeting and they try to claw back what they agreed to. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Armenians are attempting this, because I have no information about what has taken place inside the meetings itself. I'm only recounting the anecdote in order to suggest another instance where the negotiators of one side in bilateral discussions had no mandate to negotiate, but only to listen and report. And given how sensitive things are sometimes in the Armenian political class and the Armenian political sphere and the Armenian political elite, if this is the case, it would not be difficult to understand. I don't know it's the case, but it's another possibility.
And I just realized that there are so many things I would like to discuss with you. Probably I will not have time. It's already very clear to me. But I would like to reflect on the EU civilian mission. As I'm sure you know, their mandate has been prolonged. And as we understand, one of those issues in the context of the text of the peace treaty, in relation to which sides have not achieved consensus, relates to prohibition on third-party presence on the border. And we have third-party presence on the Armenian side of the border. How would this, do you think, affect the peace negotiations? And because also I would like to refer to, of course, it's not what the government of Armenia said, but one of the opposition members in Yerevan said that EU civilian missions presence is very important, and border between Azerbaijan and Armenia is a border between two civilizations, between Europe and the world which is not Europe. So, of course, this sort of language, coupled with Azerbaijani misgivings about what they're doing actually on the other side of border, how would the cumulative impact of this, do you think, will affect the peace negotiations?
Well, that language, of course, is not new. It's attempting to play to a particular audience in Europe, not excluding, I must say, the Nordic and the Baltic countries, whose parliamentary representatives, as you know, were recently in Yerevan. I might say that, just to give an indication, when I was in Baku last year, and I was speaking with not a diplomatic representative of one of the Baltic states, but someone from one of the Baltic states who was serving in an international organization. When this person told that this person had an invitation to Baku, their foreign office said, "Oh, but do they want you to visit Nagorno-Karabakh?" And the answer was, "Well, no, it's just a conference in Baku." And they said, "Well, okay, then you can go." So there is, that's of course, that's unhelpful, but it's a political fact, for some people. Now, as to the EUMA, the European Union monitoring, in practical terms, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been extended for 2 years. And if the Armenian constitution preamble will not be revised, if the Armenia will not adopt a new constitution, including a preamble, until, say, late 2026, then 2 years from now, it will come up for renewal again in early 2027. Perhaps it will not be renewed. That's practical aspect. Could say more about that, but about its past, about its current status, about the bureaucratic conflicts within the European Union, or the political conflicts at the elite level of the European Union over who will conduct foreign policy. That may be of interest, but it's not really a direct answer to your last question. And I will wait for you to say whether you were interested in it or not.
Well, it's bearing in mind the time limitations, I would like to move to another compartment of Azerbaijani-Armenian dynamics involving the opening of communications. I think a year ago, the Paul Goebel, the former advisor to the US State Secretary, told me that the wider conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia it's not just about Karabakh. Karabakh is only one element within that wider confrontation. The second important element involves the southern Armenia, the Zangezur part. And he said that Azerbaijan, of course, Azerbaijan officials are saying that it is absolutely vital for Azerbaijan to have an unhindered, the passage, overland passage, unobstructed passage to connect with Nakhchivan exclave. He said that this issue probably would not be the reason for war, of course, but still it's part of the wider conflict, wider confrontation. How do you see the future of the Zangezur debate? Because what is very interesting about Zangezur, although I earlier mentioned that negotiations are purely bilateral, there's one element there which is not purely bilateral. It involves Russia as well, not just because of the 10 November Declaration and Article 9, but also because we have actually Intergovernmental Commission, which is technically still functioning, and it involves Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. How do you see the future of that debate, very briefly, if I may ask?
Well, to start with, I'm not quite sure where to start, but I'll start somewhere. Article 9 is not legally binding. Just as there is an article in the November 2020 document that foresaw the presence of Russian peacekeepers on the territory of Azerbaijan for 5 years. And that was overtaken by circumstances. And it was not in force after they left. There was a time in 2021, 2022, when the Russian Foreign Ministry insisted that the EU could not intermediate between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the US could not intermediate between Azerbaijan and Armenia, because it was Russia's responsibility and legal obligation to do this because of the November 2020 trilateral declaration. Well, it's not a binding declaration under international law because it's not a treaty. Arguments can be made that this is binding in such a manner. Analogies have been made to executive orders by the US president. But the same US president can also reverse his last executive order. He can reverse the executive order of the previous president. He can also reverse his own executive order. So that third-party participation in the satisfaction of the spirit of Article 9 is not required. I'll just leave it at it's not required. I recall, your question recalls to me two things I've read in the last 2 months. One being a statement by a Turkish minister may have been after meeting an Armenian counterpart, I'm not sure, saying that the quarter will be functional by 2028. And you can provide perhaps on the second point of reference additional detail, perhaps. I remember reading very recently that the Prime Minister Pashinyan had been cited as saying, perhaps to an Azerbaijani counterpart, I don't recall, as saying that, well, yes, actually, maybe there could be some rail traffic through Megri to Nakhchivan. And, after that happens, eventually there could be some passenger traffic. If this is the case, then this is the most direct statement by any Armenian representative and by the highest executive official of the positive reception, let us say, for the or the absence of a rejection of establishing those communications. I'm making reference to Article 9, back to Article 9, as you know. The border guard division of the Russian FSB has been removed from that border now by Prime Minister Pashinyan. Who might be, we don't know who might replace them. Armenians, Europeans, Americans, that I'm sure that will be probably subject to discussion, not formal negotiation, but I'm certain that there are indirect track two discussions about this. I don't know it for a fact, but it's the sort of thing that there should be track two discussions about, amongst other things. And of course, there's the question of Iranian reticence or hostility to the Zangezur corridor. I believe it's fair to say that Iran has lost a good deal of its diplomatic influence in the region since October 7th, 2023. And that with the accession to power of President Trump in Washington, one would not be surprised if Iran were much more concerned about things happening inside its borders than things happening outside its borders. So that its ability to put pressure on any situation or on any settlement of the Zangezur corridor has probably diminished for the foreseeable future. I'm not able to wrap that up into a nice little package to answer your question, but those are the considerations that your question elicits. I hope they're useful.
And I just realized I'm just examining the list of the questions. I was planning to ask about the Turkish-Armenian normalization, about the Armenia's reliance on Russia and the increase in their trade turnover, giving rise to the claims that Armenia is helping Russia circumvent sanctions levied against it. I'm not able to ask all of those questions, but my last question, the very last question, is going to be about this Russia-Azerbaijan tensions, in particular after, of course, 25th of December. We are now familiar with the preliminary report. I think everything indicates that the plane crash was induced by external interference. Azerbaijani president very recently made a very clear statement. He referred to the tragedy of 20th of January. And he said that Soviet Union was behind it. Everybody knows it, of course. But the timing is very important. He talked about the illegal transfer of Zangezur from Soviet Azerbaijan to Soviet Armenia, and also reiterated that Azerbaijan does not have any territorial claim towards Armenia. He talked about the killing of Karabakh Khan as well. So very, very interesting statements are being made. Some people say that Azerbaijan is punching above its weight. How do you evaluate Azerbaijan's mode of action at this very critical juncture when it comes to Russia?
Well, Azerbaijan is very arguably attained to the status of a middle power. It is acting as an autonomous sovereign state, which may be a surprise to people in Moscow and elsewhere. But punching above its weight is the phrase that was always applied to Canada in the 1950s and the 1960s. Canada during the first half of the Cold War was your classic middle power. Uh, and that was the phrase that was frequently applied to it. To me, speaking individually, it's a matter of course. This is how a self-respecting state that has resources available to it, not to be dependent on external patrons, will act. And as you know, there's also the precedent concerning the Russian helicopter that was shot down over Nakhchivan, or next to Nakhchivan, that led in 2022 to the Russian insistence on an immediate ceasefire before Azerbaijani military forces had the opportunity to proceed from Shusha to Khankendi, which they had literally in their sight because you can see it from there. And Azerbaijan at the time admitted responsibility, indemnified the family, presented apologies, and although it was not related, signed the November 2020 trilateral declaration, so that there is, and I'm confident that this precedent is in the minds of political and diplomatic leaders of Azerbaijan, and that they have no reason not to expect that Russia should behave in the same responsible manner. I'll add as a note, what's clear is that Azerbaijani, I think that this has very much affected, you will know better than I in Baku, but this is my view from a distance. I will ask you the question. I will conclude this interview by asking you a question. That this event seems to have galvanized Azerbaijani public opinion in a certain respect concerning the Russian profile. It has made Russia to be much less sympathetic in the view of Azerbaijan public than it might have been before, given the popularity of the Russian language and Russian culture in Azerbaijan, and the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Azerbaijan, for example, that the attitude toward the Russian state may have undergone, I don't know whether it can be repaired. I will ask you that question, and we can conclude there.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question, perhaps to which there is no clear answer, and it could be the subject of our next discussion and interview, to which I'm looking forward. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Cutler. Thank you very much indeed for this lovely, engaging conversation. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you for all the excellent questions.
This was Dr. Robert Cutler, Director and Senior Fellow at Energy Security Programme, NATO Association of Canada, with whom we discussed a wide range of issues related to the Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process, the nature of the negotiations, wider regional matters, and also the latest situation involving post-plane crash situation regarding Azerbaijan and Russia. See you very soon.